Okay, everybody, I hope can hear me because sometimes it doesn't always say whether or not this is, or as it's recording. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. It says it's recording. All right. Let's do, okay. Welcome. I have a couple of things briefly to mention before we get started. Today's lecture will end definitely earlier than usual, but that doesn't mean that the small number of slides by themselves, just by that fact alone, does not indicate that none of those slides we're going to cover today might be or won't, I mean, be on the final. Any of them could be. Remember, until we do the review the week before final exams. But I did want to mention a couple of things before we get started. One is that I'm not going to call names out now. If it gets close to like a week before finals, I may do that. But there's still 6, so you're not alone if you're one of these people. 6 people registered, currently active, still on my roster, who haven't yet turned in their second papers. So hopefully those people whose names shall remain unmentioned at this point know who you guys are, and obviously you have that option. I've always said that it's a given in my class, but I wouldn't wait too much longer. It is getting down to, you know, the wire or whatever that phrase means. Never understood that phrase. What does that mean? The what, wire, where, when? But the deadline, of course, which really shouldn't be even as late as the week before finals, because you ought to be focused on studying for finals for all your classes as well as this one. Okay, so don't back yourself, as I like to say, into a corner by waiting till the last minute and rushing through and not getting a good grade. It's 10 points off no matter when you turned in, but the deadline is the week, the Saturday before the final exams week. And that's on your syllabus, so I'm not going to restate that. Okay, so those 6 people hopefully will, focus on getting those papers done and turned in to me, and then I can get them back to you sooner, so you'll know how many points you have heading into the final and how many you need to get the grade you want, as well as extra credit. Don't forget, nobody's come close to doing anything. I think the most anyone's done is 20 points. Anybody have any questions about extra credit or assignments? I hear some background noise. Okay, and then my next comment is going to be very brief, and I think everyone will agree. This class is an art history class, so I focus on the history of each period, each style, each culture, each work of art. But I don't think it's irrelevant to mention, and I'm going to say it up front, I'm not going to get partisan. This is not a political science class, so what you believe on what the Supreme Court clearly just decided to do is your business, and I wouldn't dream of trying to say anything partisan, but just a general observation. Anyone who still thinks either voting in general, I've had students say this, doesn't matter, has no impact on your daily life, and if you're too busy, who cares? Or even some of my conscientious students who say, well, I'll vote in a presidential election, that's when it matters. Think again. This fall's election matters, no matter what your belief is, what candidate, your philosophy or political issue you're most passionate or believe in most. It matters. And if you're already sure that the person you want is going to win because you live in whatever kind of a district, I'm talking about the congressional elections, obviously for both houses, the Supreme Court can be affected by that. But more importantly, laws can be passed, and they can become national laws, not just state by state, the way this Supreme Court decision is. Keep that in mind, whatever your point of view is. And so if you live in a space that's, or place that's safe politically, in your point of view is the dominant one, it's true that you might not affect that election, but you can sit down in a comfortable setting. And I've done it with my daughter when she was in middle school. I've done it many times before that. Make a few phone calls or emails to contact people to get out the vote for whatever issue it is you believe in any of the other states where it will make a difference. But it will this fall. However things go, there'll probably be quite a few changes that you may or may not have already thought of. But I'm just saying, if you didn't already know this, then it matters. Votes matter. Congressional elections off year, they call them. They're not just a minor sideshow. This time especially is even more important. Okay, that's it. End of soapbox. Statement just for those who might think, oh, well, do I need to vote, if it's not presidential election or at all? Okay, if what happens you don't agree with, you have only yourself to blame. The Romans said it, speaking of ancient history. I can't even say, it's a Latin phrase. It's actually enshrined in many state governments, buildings. And I think it's somewhere in part of Washington, some government building in Latin. He who remains silent gives consent. So food for thought. All right. One last thing, and we'll get started with this briefer selection of slides today, but there's more information on them than there often are. So we'll still end at least 15, 20 minutes early. I held this up before, but not probably everyone who was here on the Monday lecture was able to see it. The same issue occurs with this glossy cover of a hardback book that is on the building, and the cover is the point. That is the Christian Science Church in Berkeley, designed by the first green architect in America, the man who conceived the concept of nature. He called it nature-based design philosophy. The first Bay tradition, it was called. That, even though we don't cover it in this class, if you don't get to 19th or 20th century architecture, if you choose for 20 points extra credit to attend my walking tour, we will start at that building, and I'm 95% certain we'll be going into it. It's spectacular inside. You might get some hint of that from the photo that I chose for the cover of this book on that architect. And then we'll see the interiors of it. Now I've confirmed 3 other buildings that are designed by famous Bay Area architects in the early 20th century. And those are buildings you couldn't otherwise get into. So just for attending the tour is 20 extra credit. I will email you all by the end of next week with the details. Once I pin down, if we're starting with that building, the address, and directions and all that. It'll be 2 on May 22nd. That's Sunday, from 2 to 4:30 is the usual length of the tour. So, and parking free on Sunday. That's Sundays for all of my walking tours. I haven't done one in almost 3 years, since several months before the pandemic. Now, that could change. There's no wood in this room. I guess there is fake wood up above where I'm sitting. If there's another huge sudden surge beyond just what we're seeing now, and the rules are all much tighter, that might make it difficult, if not impossible. So I'd say it's 90% certain that we'll proceed with the tour. Everyone in the JC has to be, I've told the people in the buildings we're going into, hopefully this isn't overstating it, is required in my in-person classes to be vaccinated, but you're not, of course, if you're right. I mean, if you're online, how can they enforce that? However, for your own sake, if you haven't already, that might be wise if you're planning to come on the tour. I assume most people would think that already, have thought that through. I am, and boosted. I'm going to get a second booster next week. What else can you do besides take normal precautions? But you will need to bring masks, because it's possible one, if not more, of the 4 interiors we're going to visit on the walking tour might request, if not, well, they can't require it if the state doesn't, but actually county governments can. So that could change. It could be required for interior group settings. But at the moment, it's optional, but you should have your mask with you just as a precaution for yourself, as well as other people, and possibly who are hosting us may require that. Okay, well, I'll get to that when we finalize the details. All right, so before we get to today's topics, any questions, today's slides about extra credit? Someone's microphone is on. I'm not sure who that is. Probably Rachel. No, not you. I don't know. Can't never tell. All right. So any questions? Again, I always stick around at the end. That's always been my unofficial office hours, is when I do right after the last slide. Okay, but before we get to the slides, this is actually good for those of you who are here. That's just a little over 50% of the enrollment. Actually, it's a little more like 2/3. For those who aren't, I hope they take notes on this, because there are 3 terms that we did not cover, and 2 of them we're going to see in the slides today, but I didn't do the first one. 3 definitions on your list of terms. So if you haven't already done that, before we get started with the first slide, just turn to the page where I already did cover, and I'm going to go over it again. 5 main features of Gothic churches. I held up a diagram, and that's already, of course, on the recorded lecture video that will be posted on YouTube. This time it should be before 8 p.m. on Friday. Anyway, so we covered that. We did not do, I'm going to give these definitions slowly and repeat them each once. So you can get them. And then there's only one more definition, and that'll be next week, the last one. Okay, here we go. Flamboyant style. Everybody knows what the word flamboyant means, right? Well, it comes from this term, this style. So here we go, the definition of flamboyant style. It's a style of late Gothic architecture invented in France, comma. A style of late Gothic architecture invented in France, comma, which used flame-like decorations along the exterior. It doesn't only mean churches, but it's most commonly found in churches like cathedrals. So I'll say it again one more time. Flamboyant style was a style of late Gothic architecture invented in France, comma, which used flame-like decorations along the exterior. I should say plural, exteriors. Obviously, it's for more than one building, which use flame-like decorations along the exteriors, period. So we saw an example, but when we get started with the slides in just a couple minutes, I'll backtrack briefly. I'm not going to restate the notes you already should have, or you will when you watch the video of the last slide. I think it was we covered, or one of the last ones on Monday of Reims Cathedral. I'll show you an example in case you weren't here for that, but I didn't really make it clear. By the way, a simple side note here, flamboyant is a French word that means flame-like. So in case you know, some of you do, the pejorative about that guy's a real flaming I'm not going to say the word. Obviously, you know the word I'm thinking of. People who behave badly, especially ones zipping in and out of traffic like I see every day on 101 when I drive up here from Berkeley. I mean, really, there are accidents waiting to happen. And my daughter will say, that guy's a flaming blank blank. Okay, that phrase originated in medieval France from this architecture style. Because when someone was flamboyant, they were acting like a flame-like, destructive, negative, harmful, however you want to say that, like flames in a fire. So some French people started calling misbehaving fellow citizens flamboyant or flame-like. If you're curious, that's the root of the word flamboyant. So if you call someone a flaming so-and-so, you're going back to medieval French architecture as the origin for that phrase. All right, next style, the second of the three we're covering definitions, is decorated style. Again, these are on your list of terms, so I'm not going to spell these two. Decorated. Okay, so that's a style, let's say decorated style is a style of late medieval architecture invented in England, a style of late medieval architecture invented in England, comma, which used heavy ornamental detail. Heavily, I'll say it again, heavily ornamental details carved along the exteriors. Again, it's not only for churches it was used, so I'll repeat the whole thing. Decorated style is a style of late Gothic, I hope I said it that way the first time, of late Gothic architecture invented in England, comma, which used heavily decorated details carved along the exteriors. You'll see how that is the very first slide we're going to see in just about a minute or so. Okay, if anyone needs to repeat any of these three before we start the slides up, Okay, now the last definition, perpendicular. We're going to see one example of that today. Perpendicular style. A style of late Gothic architecture invented in England, comma, which used perpendicular lines and ornamentation along the interior and exterior. So that's where it's different. It used them on both interiors, and we're going to see in it. I'll say it again slowly. And then if anyone wants to repeat any one of these three, please raise your hand or speak up. Once again, last definition for this week. Perpendicular style is a style of late Gothic architecture invented in England, comma, which used perpendicular lines and ornamentation on the interiors and exteriors. All right, that's all the definitions for now, but I kind of didn't go over those before. So does anybody need me to repeat any of those? Okay, so I need to pull up the definitions. I mean, not definitions, I'm sorry, the slides, and that shouldn't take too long. But sometimes it takes a minute. So bear with me here. There we go. It's this right here. Okay, yeah. Let's start with this one. We covered this, but I'm going to just explain much more clearly than I did before how this is an example of the first of the three new styles, the flamboyant style. I'll explain that. Okay, share screen. So that should, let's see, where did it go? What? Okay, let me get this out of here. Sometimes things malfunction. By the way, you may not know, but the entire campus email system, I thought it was maybe just me or something, but there was a breakdown and people couldn't email. That's why I couldn't send you some of my handouts. Okay, return to meeting. Oh, that's what it is. Okay, I didn't leave the meeting, but somehow the meeting left me. All right. Oh boy. I'm not sure why it's behaving like this.
I think you're on screen share.
Yeah, I know.
Can you see his screen?
Yeah, we can.
Yeah,
Could
but
you
then
show
where's
the
the slide I just put up? There's no,
Oh, what do you-
I already did it.
It
It's,
shows on the desktop.
oh, okay. But I need to see them. Thank you. Thank you. I really appreciate that. But what I should do now is just try it one more time, because if I can't see them, then I can't, of course, give you guys an accurate, detailed description of what we're talking about. So just hang on. Here we go. Here's the file that I've already. Now, normally I did this before class, but I got here a little later than usual due to crazy drivers on 101. Stop. Now, okay. Can you guys see this?
Yeah.
Good. We're all set to go. All right. I'm not going to ask you to take more notes now because we covered this slide. And if you didn't see it, you do want to. This is one that has about a 50-50 chance of being on the exam, but I will cut. I promised. I've said this before, but not all of you were here when I said it, that I will cut at least a couple of the cathedrals from the study list because there's several of them. And I know some people feel they can start looking alike. But we'll decide those, which ones to cut on the review class. Okay, so for now, I just want to point out that this, which we covered, if you haven't seen it, you will want to take notes when you watch the video from the last lecture. Reims Cathedral, R-E-I-M-S Cathedral, is this church. Again, you don't have to take any more notes on it unless, well, no, we'll just wait till you see the video because that's where I give all the information on the meaning and the formal elements. Why am I showing it to you now is because it's a classic example of the flamboyant style. I probably mentioned it, but I don't think I hadn't given you the definition yet. And so now that you have the definition, I hope it's more clear what that means when you see it. These are flames licking up the side of this main portal. Of course, these are portals, obviously. The tri-portal, remember, that's part of the meaning of all Gothic cathedrals, at least certainly. Well, yeah, all Gothic cathedrals, most of which are Catholic. In this period in history, they were all Catholic. There were no Protestants. So, you know, Gothic cathedrals or Catholic cathedrals, even more modern ones, have three doorways, right? So above the main portal of the tri-portals, the main doorway, the widest one, there are flame-like ornaments, but they're also present. You can just sort of tell from this where I'm using the cursor along, you know, supposed to be like literally fire, flames licking up the side of the church. Not that they were trying to incite vandalism or otherwise, you know, give, you know, a vandal or, you know, mob any ideas about attacking the church. That would have happened hundreds of years later in the French Revolution. No, the point of it is the flame-like passion that these churches were supposed to inspire among their worshipers. The idea that if life was horrible, which it was for 98% of the population, only the upper classes, you know, nobility and very wealthy, powerful landowners had a, you know, good life back then. So if you were living the average life, let alone a really poor person's life in medieval Europe, not just France, anywhere in the Middle Ages in Europe, your life was pretty miserable. So you would have perhaps only felt any kind of hope for the future in a better life after this one, supposedly, right? If you follow the teachings of the Catholic Church, you pray, you go to church regularly, and you follow their, uh, rules, their beliefs faithfully all through this life. Even if it's miserable, the next life will be better. And so you would be passionate about that. Supposedly they were trying, and it did have factual bearing. Or I should say, in reality, there were peasants who would get very emotional. Many people do today. They're often called fundamentalists. Quite a few churches, and not just, in the South, but other parts of the world. And not only Christian churches. Obviously, every religion has some subgroup within them that is more passionate than others of that religion, and who believe more passionately or fervently or devoutly. Any of those words would fit. And so they are on fire. That's the phrase, right? You're on fire with a belief in some kind of a philosophy, a religion, or even a political concept, or whatever belief system you have. So these people were devout Christians, the peasants and working class people came to these churches, and they were supposed to be inspired to be literally on fire with their religious beliefs, because life was so awful. Especially when this church was built, there was the 100-Year War with England that killed millions of people, and then the Black Plague, right? The Black Death, they called it, killed 1/3, 1 out of every 3 people, way worse than COVID has, all throughout Europe. So it was a time of great suffering and fear and death, but people had only one thing to turn to, most people, and that was religion. So that's what the flames are symbolic of. All right, let's move ahead now to our first must know. Wait a minute, there it is. Okay. So here we go. If you see down on your list, it's actually in the middle of this week 13 list. And it is Salisbury Cathedral. Salisbury Cathedral, and the word, it's a town in England, is spelled just like the steak that's named after this place. Salisbury is Salisbury. Salisbury Cathedral, England, and the date 1330. Okay. Well, let's start with the fact there are so many things about this church that are remarkable. By the way, quick tip for those who manage to get to England. Well, most people, I think they only have a week or so. They just stay in and around London. I understand why it's such an amazing city and there's so much to see. But if you get a little longer time to visit, go here, go to this town. I would make it high on your list, if not very close second to seeing all the sights of London. Salisbury. There's 3 things about that city. This is not something you have to take notes on, but just for those, some of you will eventually go to England, or if you have been and you didn't get here and you go back, make a special trip to Salisbury. You can do it on a train. It pretty much has to be overnight if you're going to see everything. So one night, and then go back, whatever, where you're staying, I guess, in London. That's what I usually do. Okay, so it's like 80 miles outside of London. So what do we have here? We have the cathedral. I'll explain why it's worth a visit. By itself, it'd be worth going to the city of Salisbury. Another reason is the town. It's the most charming medieval town. It looks like it did 500 years ago, but of course now there's electricity and cars. But I mean, the buildings, the architecture in the old town wasn't ever bombed in World War II, and it wasn't redeveloped into, fake strip malls with tin half timber, fake medieval looking architecture. It's all authentic, hundreds of years old. Some of the buildings are 1,000 years old. The town itself is very charming. It's a very popular tourist site for most European countries. When they come to England, they know this. And then the third thing is it's Stonehenge. Stonehenge is about 6 miles outside of Salisbury, the nearest town, and you can easily take a bus or even maybe a taxi. I don't know what taxis or Ubers are in England now, but you probably could afford that if you split it with someone. And that, of course, is again only one site alone that it's almost worth going to see by itself. So you've got these 3 really interesting historic places that you can see, all in the vicinity of one town, Salisbury. Okay, so let's now start taking notes on the meaning of this church. So there are several things about it that mark it as unique or make it a unique building in the British Isles, right? or Great Britain, you could say it either way. Two words are usually synonymous. England, Ireland, Scotland, and Wales. Okay, but just say in Great Britain. So in Great Britain, this church is unique, different than any other church in several ways. Let's start with the fact that it has the tallest tower, or you could say spire, because that's the part at the top, right? The tallest spire of any church in the British Isles, anywhere. It's 405 feet tall. There's no other church in England, medieval, Gothic, or early, or modern, that is that tall. So it has the tallest church tower or spire in all the British Isles, over 400 feet. The second thing about it is that it has a double nave. I'm sorry, oops, I misspoke. A double transept. Now you pretty much have to use that word because otherwise it doesn't work. The nave, remember, is the long, narrow aisle that always goes perpendicular to the transepts, and that's transcept. The transepts are some people call them the crossing, but that's actually inaccurate because not just anything that forms the shape of a cross is a transept, is the structural section of the building that helps support the weight of the tower. So there are two of them, one on either side of the tower. There are a few other churches in Europe that do that, but it's very rare. Only a handful, maybe 3 or 4 in all of Great Britain. Again, I'll say that second feature marks this as unique is that it has a double transept. These, of course, run obviously all the way out the other wall and just as far on the other side. And so they are there. Why? Because they're necessary to help support the weight of you can imagine, massive weight of that tower. So it has double transept. And then another feature is that it has the first airplane warning light in all of Great Britain. I tried to find a nighttime view of this. I have my own slides of it at night. That light has been there for over 100 years, since around 1920, to warn airplanes because of this spire being so tall. And it's the only structure that's anywhere near that high. So, it gets foggy quite often. This is Southern England. It gets foggy, right? A lot in England, especially in the winter. So if you were flying one of those early, airplanes, you could easily crash into this tower if you didn't see it because of the fog. So it had an airplane warning light, the first one in the British Isles. If you're curious, it blinks about every 5 seconds and it's red. And you can see it from miles away. I've seen it, but I couldn't find a slide that showed that, but that's it right there. And then another fact about it, there's 2 more that mark it as distinct or unique among all churches in Britain, is the original medieval wall is intact around the entire, you can say yard, but the right word is close. That's an actual medieval term. So however you want to write that word, you can write it yard or close. Close means an enclosed yard in medieval architecture terms. So let's just restate that. It has one of the few, I don't know if it's the only one, but I've never seen another one. One of the very rare, there we go, it's very rare example of an intact medieval wall surrounding the entire yard, or if you want to be correct, in parentheses, the close. That's the British word for that. That means nothing has been altered inside that wall. There are no modern buildings. A lot of churches sell off the land they own. Of course, everyone knows this, right? If you've ever driven by, let alone gone to a church in California, a lot of them are surrounded by modern buildings and they originally owned the land. Most churches owned bunches of land around them and then sold off to make money over the decades. They never did that here. This is an intact churchyard that is very large. It's got to be something like a square, half a mile square at least. You don't have to write that. Just it's a very large enclosed yard. That is the original wall, handmade by monks in the Middle Ages. There we go. It's not as clear a view as the ones I've taken, but my slides are not digitalized of this building. So you can just see enough of it that you can tell that is an 700-year-old wall, the original wall. Probably took years for the monks to make it. And of small pieces of stone and mortar, whatever they used to hold it together. And it's intact. There's no section of it missing. But to me, the most remarkable thing about this church is it has the oldest working clock in the world, not just the British Isles. I'll say it again. This church has the oldest working clock on Earth, you can say, or in the world. It was put on the wall, attached to the wall of the nave. It's right about here. I've been inside this church a couple times, near the top, and it is a pendulum and pulley clock. It's one of those real, well, hey, 700 years ago, they didn't have mechanical clocks. The Renaissance later on did some, maybe 200 years or even 100 years later, but not in the early 1300s. So I'll say it again, has the oldest working clock. It's been working every day for almost 700 years. And it's wooden clock with Roman numerals. You don't have to write the details, but if you're curious what it looks like, with a huge face, it's got like be 12 feet across. So you can see it from the entire interior of the church. So wherever you're sitting, in case the sermon is going on too long, you could look at the clock. I know I'm amazed they even put it there, because that would make people think, how much longer do I have to sit here right now? No, don't write that. But depending on what it is you want to know about what time it is, nobody had a watch. No, people didn't have clocks in their homes. Maybe some kings had small, a small kind of timepiece for their own private rooms in their castle, but that's about it. So it was one of the first timepieces anyone in the British Isles had ever seen. And of course, all the peasants who came here would marvel at it. It's been kept working. It has to be rewound every 3 days, by the way, if you're curious, by hand. But it's all run on pulleys with ropes and weights, and it's very complex, but it keeps accurate time, has been now for 700 years. So now that might be enough, more than enough for the meaning, if this is on the essay part of the exam, which it has. Let's say, I'm not going to cut this one for the study list. Okay. At this point, I say it's, fairly decent chance it'll end up on the final. But the last part of the meaning is the style. As always, whatever style of architecture a building is part of the meaning. This is the English decorated style. Or for short, we just say decorated, because I just mentioned the definition is it was invented in England. The decorated part is the tower. Look carefully on the walls, and you can see here where the pointed arch windows are. And here's your flying buttresses, by the way. All the doors and windows are pointed arched. Of course, it's a Gothic style church. But here, there's no decoration carved into the walls, is there? None. The tower, the entire length of the tower, and even in the spire, if we back up a little, well, let's do this. And you can see every, whatever 20 feet or so, there's more carved stone decorations. Of course, it's stone. So once again, this church is considered an example of the decorated style, because when the tower was built, the last part, of course, that was finished would have been the tower. The entire tower was designed or created in the English decorated, or you can just say decorated style, and that obviously, I mean, you can see, you can see that that's what it is if you just take a closer look here at the carved decoration. They didn't leave any plain uncarved or undecorated stone surfaces, whereas they did on the older part. This part of the church was built before that style was invented. So the entire tower, from the bottom of the roof line, or I should say the bottom of the tower, is about where this cursor is, all the way to up to the top of the spire, has carved stone decorations, which define this as an example of English decorated style. All right, formal analysis. It is symmetrical. In this slide, it may be hard to tell that, but I've stood right there. Like I said, if I had my own slide to show you, well, you'd see how if you stood between these two transepts, these two wings or arms of the cross is what they're like, and you'd see the tower's dead center in the middle, and evenly spaced on either side. The nave runs the same length on to the left and the right of the tower. So it is completely symmetrical, left to right. It would be the same if you stood here and looked at it, right, from this, and that's where the entrance is. And obviously it's not, or unbalanced toward the bottom, because of the obvious width of the building. The nave and the transepts, the interior part of the building is much wider, obviously unbalanced toward the bottom. Rhythm, again, with a Gothic architecture is pretty straightforward. That's very strong rhythm in all Gothic buildings, because all the doors and windows are pointed arched. The flying buttresses, right, there's one, another one, there's more here. All of them have the same basic shape. And then, of course, the decorations carved on the tower all repeat And then you have these finials. You don't need to know that word for the exam because you have enough terms. But these little endpoints, they're called finials. Not only Gothic churches use them, Victorian houses did, and town halls, and Harry Potter's town. What the heck is that town called? I can never remember. Potterville, is it? No. That's yeah. What is the name of that town? The town in Harry Potter that he goes when he goes to school. There's a name for it. Hogwarts. Isn't it?
Hogsmeade. I mean,
No.
the name of the school is Hogwarts.
Yeah, but the town that it's in. Okay, forget. I was asking my daughter.
London.
No. I'm talking about the mythical town where everything is Gothic. If you didn't know that, by the take.
Hogsmeade. Yeah, I was right.
That's the name of, okay, whatever. Anyway, it's a popular style with modern filmmakers for not only Harry Potter's extremely ornately decorated sets, and those are probably sets. It could be real buildings that they built for the movie. Anyway, they all have this kind of perpendicular Gothic, I mean, not perpendicular, decorated, decorated Gothic style. The carved details in the wood. So it could be in wood too, but on a church, it's going to be stone and it's going to be carved and it's on the exterior. Okay, so let's finish up here. So stable, well, of course, like all architecture, it's partly the corners of the buildings are stable. And the overall walls, sides of the church and each section, but there's so much dynamic to it. The tower obviously tapers up on that spire, all the doors and windows have pointed arches, and all the finials, there we are with that word again, are all dynamic. And then we have the color. You can't tell from this slide. I don't know why, but on the internet lately, it's been harder, at least for me, to find colored slides of a really sharp view that shows the entire image. I used to be able to show a slide that had this exact view, might even been the same photographer, in color, but this is the only version that wasn't encrypted, right? So I could use it. So it's black and white, but I'll tell you now, it's pink. The stone is pink. Rare, very rare for church stone color to be pink. So it's warm. It's a warm color. The textures, of course, are the real rough texture of stone all the way up to the top of the tower, and the real smooth texture of glass in the windows, and then the real smooth texture of metal. That's actually metal on the roof. That's probably not the original roof, but that's what's there now. It's metal siding. Probably lost the original roof in a fire, or just it got too old, so they replaced it with metal. So that's the actual real textures are all no simulated textures. Real smooth metal on the roof, real smooth glass in the windows, and real rough stone along the walls. Then for space, I've given you one dimension. I'll repeat it though. Remember, that's the actual measurements of the building. The tower is just a little over 400 feet. You can just round it off or be more precise. It's 405 feet tall. And the nave is surprisingly, it's only 110 feet tall. That's not a very tall nave as naves go, but that is the dimensions of the roof or ceiling inside the building, I should say. So the interior space is 110 feet to the peak of the ceiling. The largest mass, pretty obvious, the tower, then the nave, then each transept in that order. The lines are carved on the decorations, especially along the tower, and visual along the corners of the building. And then let's see, balance, rhythm, modeling. The modeling is just the natural shadows from the sunlight. There is no technique for modeling. Okay, before we move on, are there any questions? I know that was a lot, and you remember, you don't have to remember or write if this is on the essay part of the final, all of the things I told you, just 6 of the facts on the meaning and 6 of the 9 elements. But with architecture, I give you all the elements because it's not so obvious as it is with the painting. By now, you guys have written, at least most of you have at least one paper on painting, and you know how to do that. Architecture takes a little more specific analysis to do the formal analysis, elements or formal analysis. So any questions before we move on? All right. This is the next must know. And it is at the bottom of this week's list. So, and it's a bit of a long title, so I'll say it slowly. And of course, spell the words and repeat it at least once. This is the Chapel of Henry VII. Now that's Roman numerals, which is like the letters VII. Don't confuse it with Henry VIII. 2 very different people, though they were father and son. I'll explain in a minute. Chapel of Henry VII, VII. at Westminster Abbey. Now, I've seen Abbey spelled both ways, so I will accept the way I saw it when I did the original syllabus for this class, but I've had a lot of people write paper on this or other Abbeys and spell it with an E. So you can either spell it this way, A-B-B-Y, or A-B-B-E-Y. Either one, it depends on, I don't know, guess which country you're in as to whether which is more common. Again, Westminster Abbey, London, 1516. So let me spell those words, the ones that aren't obvious. Chapel, of course, you know how to spell, of Henry VII at Westminster is Westminster. Abbey, A-B-B-Y, or if you prefer, A-B-B-B-B-E-Y. London area knows how to spell 1516. So this is one of the latest of all the works of art we're going to see in terms of the date. So what we're looking at is really, if you were in the rest of Europe outside of the British Isles, it wouldn't be the Middle Ages, it'd be the Renaissance. But in Great Britain, it was still the Middle Ages. I'll explain that in a minute. But first, the main facts about what is this. This is an addition onto the back of Westminster Abbey. Westminster Abbey has got to be one of the most famous buildings in the world, right? That's where they used to crown the kings of England. In fact, I think they still do. Kings and queens, I should say, kings and queens of England. Also were many of them, in fact, most of them are buried for the last 700 years. The Abbey itself goes back to the Middle Ages, but this chapel is an addition on the back of Westminster Abbey. And a chapel is by definition a small room for prayer or other religious activities. So this is a small room in which the choir, I think you can see these are choir stalls. So let's get up close. This is where a boys choir sings, I don't know, I guess every Sunday, and also special occasions. So the purpose of this room would be for small, you couldn't get more than a few, dozen people in here, right? Small religious, small gatherings for various religious ceremonies or royal events, such as funerals. When Diana, so remember, she was killed in that horrible car crash in Paris. When she died, her brother gave a eulogy with her coffin right in front of him in this chapel. So it's been used for various royal family events because it was built by a king for royal family use. But that does not mean only royal family members or only people who are, quote, of royal blood, unquote, nobles. Only they can use it. No, the public is allowed in here, but a limited number because it's a small space. So it's used for various religious ceremonies where the public can attend small gatherings, and also for royal events such as funerals and weddings. Sometimes this is actually previous weddings. I can't remember. I think Diana was married here as well as the funeral was held here. Okay, so that just tells us the purpose of the building. The style, again, as always, style is part of the meaning of any architecture slide. This is a classic example of English perpendicular style. So here's where you can see, I don't have a slide the outside, one view of each of these buildings is enough that you might want to. This one, I'm not sure if I don't think I'll cut it from the study list. Pretty sure I won't, but I'm not saying it's like very probable that it'll be on the final, but it could be. Here are the perpendicular lines. You see they're in between each window. Then the shapes of the windows themselves are tall and narrow. And by definition, everyone knows what the word perpendicular means, right? The windows themselves are perpendicular, the framing of the windows and the stonework, you see it here, even all the way down to the floor, right? All of the trim, if you want to call it, that's actually an accurate word to use for that kind of decoration, but you can just say, the decorative, trim, why not use the right word? In the walls, you see this, obviously the interior of this is all perpendicular in the overall lines or the shaping of it. And that's even true of the choir stalls. Look how narrow they are and how the ornament here, it's all wood, of course. And the framing around where each, I think they're like boys around 12 years old that are chosen from all over England to sing in the choir there. It's an honor, I'm sure. And then you get all the way up to the top. You can't quite see the ceiling here, but it's let's get as close as we can. It is still perpendicular even to the very top, all the way to the ceiling, all the windows and all the framing of them and all of those stone, trim decorative features all have a perpendicular upward thrust, is the phrase would be used by an architectural critic. This building is meant to make your eyes look upward. That's the whole reason for this style, to make you think that you're in a building or a room, let's say a space or room, that's taller or larger than it is. It's an optical illusion, and I can definitely say this from personal knowledge. I've been through this building maybe 3 times. I mean, seen this chapel. It's part of the tour you can have when you go to Westminster Abbey, and tour guides constantly in English, the ones that, you can not have to translate. All kinds of tour guides will say, I've heard at least a couple times, the tour guide will say to his group of visitors, okay, look up, look at the ceiling. How tall do you think it is? And almost all the time, people will say, oh, 60 feet. 50, 70, in that it's only 35 feet. But it looks, the point is, the style creates the illusion of a much taller room than it is. And that's a deliberate feature and a purpose for this style, why it was used. Because it's a very narrow space. They didn't have a lot of room to build on, because London was already a big city by the 1500s. It was already several 100,000 people that far back. So there wasn't a lot of land to build this chapel. So it had to be narrow, and therefore they made it taller, and even appeared to be taller than it really was by using this style. So this is, I can't say it's one of the first, but yeah, you probably could. This is one of the earlier examples of this English perpendicular style. Okay, and then the last thing to say about it is these flags here. If you're curious, why are there so many flags? Well, these symbolize the various families that sided with, because this is still part of the meaning now. Henry VII is the founder of the Tudor dynasty. I think everyone knows about them, right? I mean, there's so many TV shows and documentaries and, books and what have you about the Tudors, right? The most famous dynasty that ever ruled England. They were started by him, Henry VII. It took him 30 years. I'll repeat this slowly. It's part of the meaning. Why did he build the chapel? Not just for his own use and some of his other royal guests or other family members, but to give thanks to God for having won a 30-year-long civil war. He fought a 30-year, ours was 4 years, and look how many people suffered in that. 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War. It'd be like about 7 million today. But back then, this was a civil war that lasted 30 years. You can just say he won a civil war that lasted for decades, and he came out on top. So he started the Tudor dynasty. He founded it. And if you don't know that word, I'll spell it for you. It's pretty phonetic. T-U, of course, capital T, U-D-O-R. The Tudor dynasty started with him. Henry VIII was his son, and boy, were they different. Henry VII was basically a decent person, and he did not have people executed or burned because a woman couldn't give him a male heir, or because someone criticized him, or because he thought someone was, not doing their job. As you may not know, Henry VIII had all kinds of people. It wasn't just 3 of his wives executed. He had literally hundreds of people either burned or beheaded because of some personal grudge he had. Henry VII, not saying never ordered anyone executed, but he was not vindictive that way. He was a much more, let's say, relatively moral ruler, and his son was just the opposite. So the two are very different. But this was Henry VIII's father, Henry VII. Okay, and then of course, his granddaughter, whom he never met, was Queen Elizabeth, one of the greatest rulers in the history of England, of course, the one that helped make England a world power. Okay, so let's do our formal analysis, and we'll end about, like I was guessing, around 50 minutes early, though I'll stick around for any questions. So let's start with the space. Oh, one other quick aside, you can get extra credit for this. So this is directly relevant for those of you who still could use extra credit or just want to, get extra points to give you a cushion or margin for your final grade. If you watched, I know it's going to say the Da Vinci Code. Now, Tom Hanks himself said when he was on Steve Colbert, I think it was after he did that movie, it was the worst acting job he ever did. But put that aside. The character that he plays, it's from the best-selling novel of all time. If you didn't know that, look it up. So 35 million copies, The Da Vinci Code. That movie version of that book, which isn't well done, has a scene in this chapel in which there's one of those tours I was telling you about where the tour guide talks to everybody. Now the character Tom Hanks plays the main, the hero of that movie and the book. He's there to try and find clues, about this false, a rumor that Jesus had a wife and that's the founding family for the French monarchy. And that's just silliness. But the point is there's a scene filmed right inside this chapel. And as I recall, I've seen that movie in years, the cinematographer, whatever, cameraman pans upward towards the ceiling when they're talking about how this building looks taller than this. So if you watch that movie and wrote something about what you learned about the architecture, not the plot or the acting, remember that's worth 10 points as part of extra credit options. All right, let's wrap it up with formal analysis. This is completely symmetrical. Both sides have these choir stalls. Of course, you're only looking at one side here. Identical, left to right, and absolutely, it's also balanced top to bottom because the ceiling and the floor are the same width here. Now, the largest mass, well, I would say it's all the walls on the two walls on the sides because it's long and narrow. So the longest or widest walls are the ones along the left and right. Then it would be the walls on the front, that's the entrance, right, and back wall. And then after that, I would say it's the ceiling. It is. The ceiling you can't see in the slide. I guess I couldn't find one to show the ceiling, but the ceiling is extremely ornate, carved with all kinds of decorative details. And so because of the weight of the carved wooden decorations, they're hanging down several feet for every so many feet. The ceiling, just say it's a very heavy carved stone ceiling. That would be the third largest mass. And that would make it bigger than the floor, which is just a flat piece of course, tiles. The colors are cool on the tile work, the blue and off-white tiles. I would definitely say cool on the windows, but warm on the stonework. See, that's a yellow stone, and warm on the obviously dark brown wooden color on the, dark brown color, I'm sorry, on the wooden choir stalls. You got to ignore the flags. They're not part of the building. Those are new ones. They're not 500 years old. These are all the families that backed the Tudors. I don't know if I made that clear when I started that sidebar about who was Henry VII. If you backed him, you got privileges, and that would include attending here without having to ask permission if you were in London, or your family's rights to attend special royal events and things. So that's who these people's flags represent. Different dukes and earls and things who backed the Tudors. So ignoring that, then we have line here is almost all carved everywhere. And there is the visual line. You could make the case, of course, around the outer edges of the doors and windows, as always. But most of the line you see with perpendicular style, by definition, you're going to see these are carved pieces of stonework all the way up to the ceiling, around every window, and on the choir stalls. So almost all the line is carved. The rhythm is obvious with the pointed arch doors. Doors down here, windows all the way up the wall. And of course, the stone trim or decorations, and obviously the choir stalls are exactly the same shape, repeated over and over. And the floor has repeated shapes of the diamond patterns, of course. The textures are the real smooth texture of tile on the floor, real smooth texture of glass on the windows, real rough texture of stone on the walls, and real rough texture of wood on the choir stalls. Those are the four textures. There's not really any similar textures here. The modeling is very deep shadows along the ceiling because, of course, the windows obviously only let light in up to the edge of the ceiling. So just say that the deepest shadows or strongest modeling is along the ceiling. You can just sort of tell from this corner detail. And obviously no techniques. It's just the natural shadows from the sunlight. Let's see. Yes, Elijah. You have a question? Elijah, do I see you? Oh, yeah. All right, asked to unmute. Well, I don't mute my students. Sorry, Elijah, if you want to go ahead and, oh, lowered hand. Okay, I'm sorry. I thought you had a question that you wanted to address to everybody, which we can do after we finish. We're almost done here. We're just about almost exactly at 4. Here we go. So just to finish up, then we have the space. It's a long, narrow room with a about 35-foot high ceiling, even though it appears to be to some people twice that. Just say the actual height is about 35 feet. And there isn't any other definite, feature here. It's just one long narrow room. Okay. And then let's see, we have carved line. I think I could, let's see. Oh, balance. Yeah, I did say, yeah, I think I did. Let's see, texture. Am I forgetting anything? I think we've covered everything. Oh, stable versus dynamic. Sorry, I almost forgot one of the main ones. Yes, this is both. It's stable on all of the perpendicular lines of the window framing, the windows themselves, and the trim along the walls, and even the choir stalls. But it is dynamic on the ceiling, even though you can only see the bottom edge of it. The ceiling curves up to a point, of course, and the tops of all the windows are obviously dynamic because of the pointed arches. Okay, there we go. We're finishing right about when I thought we might. So now, any questions anybody has about anything we just covered, extra credit, or your second paper, if you haven't written it yet, hopefully you'll get it in soon. Your grades on your papers, I will have them back by next week. I'm not sure, but I think it will be before the class on Wednesday, possibly even before the Monday class. But I can't guarantee that. It depends on, I don't like returning only half a class's papers. Anyone turns a paper in on time, I try to send them back to everyone all at the same time, by email, obviously with a summary of how you did or why you got what you did. That's usually obvious from the cover sheet, but sometimes it isn't. So I might add a sentence or two to what the reader wrote. But I'll be getting those back to everybody who turned their papers in on time next week. I can't promise when, but certainly before next weekend. All right. Any questions about anything that we've covered here or anything else related to your grades, extra credit, the class in general, or researching on your pay? Oh, by the way, I've seen people lose points for this. So I'll add one more thing about those who haven't yet turned your second paper in. If you're going to cite a source that was originally a print source, but it's then you took it off the internet, you need to say that's outright. I've actually had to go back and recalculate. I don't want to have to do that, and you shouldn't have to hassle with that. Ask me to do that. You need to put in parentheses in the bibliography, original print source, or from an original print source. And then maybe even say what that source was. Encyclopedia Britannica is a classic example. Always that starts out, whatever year or edition it is, in the print form, and then it's always put online. So keep in mind, if you do that and very often you don't want 5 points off for not having a printed source, you need to be clear. That's just one little extra bit of helpful advice that some people overlook, and then they get points off that they might not otherwise have had. And the 5 points could make the difference between an A and a B in this class, obviously. It's the points, at the total points you have at the end, that determine which of the letter grades you get. And of course, there is no plus or minus in this college. They're all just a straight A, B, C, D, E, and F. Okay. One more time. I'm here now for, obviously, this is the only time I have to live in, real time answer any questions you have. One more time.
Is the final still occurring on the 23rd?
Yeah, it's going to be on Monday. Yeah, good point. Because then we're done. You're done. You can then focus on whatever other deadlines, other finals you have. Yeah, it's what's on the syllabus here. Yes, and it will begin promptly at 3:15. I'll repeat this and send you an email, at least one before that. And that is the Monday of final exams week. So when we do the review on the Wednesday prior to final, you'll have 5 whole days. And remember, it's open book, open note, totally. Yes, it's going to be on the 23rd. Okay, any other questions anybody else has about anything, about the grades, extra credit over the class? Okay, well, thank you all for your, persistence and attendance, et cetera. So if you didn't get your paper in, hopefully I'll see your second paper in the next maybe several days. I would urge you to do that. Okay. All right, you guys have a good week.
Thank you too.
You're welcome.